The snow had started falling before sunrise, thick and unforgiving, layering the narrow roads of Carbon Ridge, Wyoming, in a silence too heavy for a morning that was supposed to bring peace. But peace had been a stranger in Rachel Hartman's life for a long time now. She stood motionless in the church courtyard, black coat buttoned up to her throat, her gloved hands clinging to the handle of a worn suitcase. One arm cradled Ellie, barely 3, asleep and sniffling into her mother's collar. The other reached instinctively behind her, where Jacob, Lila, and Noah huddled close. None of them spoke, not after what had just happened. The funeral had ended minutes ago, though the crowd still loitered like a bad echo. Rachel had buried her husband, Aaron Hartman, under gray skies and colder glances. He wasn't a good man, and she had known that long before the cancer took him. But she had tried. For the kids, for the vows she once whispered to herself when no one else listened. Now those same people who once nodded politely at her in grocery store aisles couldn't even meet her eyes. Dolores Brennan stood at the center of them all, Aaron's mother, wrapped in camel-colored wool, as polished as ever despite the ice on the steps. She looked at Rachel like she was filth tracked in on someone's boots. "You should have left him years ago," Dolores said, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You let him rot in that house and now you think you're owed sympathy?" Rachel blinked slowly. Not here, not in front of the children. But Dolores pressed forward, her voice rising above the murmurs. "You think you can drag those kids into a pew and pretend to grieve? You poisoned my son. You ruined him. Now he's dead and you expect kindness." She gestured wildly at the children. "This is what you have left? Strays?" "Mom," Lila whispered, barely audible. "Why is she yelling?" Rachel didn't answer. She tightened her grip on the suitcase. Her stomach clenched when Dolores's next words sliced the air. "You are no longer family. You were his mistake. Now you're someone else's burden. You're not welcome in my home. Not in this town. Not in this family. Take your bastards and go." No one stopped her. No one even flinched. A man near the back shifted uncomfortably and turned his face toward the snow. Another coughed and looked at his shoes. No one spoke up. No one reached for Rachel, not even the pastor. "Let's go," Rachel said quietly, her voice brittle. Jacob grabbed Noah's hand, guiding him toward the gate. Lila followed, brushing away angry tears. Ellie stirred in Rachel's arms, but didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the night her father died, as if even at 3, she understood grief had already taken too much. They stepped off the church grounds into the slushy street. No car, no family, nowhere to go. The snow soaked their boots and crept into their socks like cold truth. Rachel pulled Ellie's hat tighter over her ears, whispering words that had lost meaning days ago. "Just a little farther, sweetheart. We'll find something soon." She didn't know where they were going. She only knew they couldn't stay. The hours blurred. The town grew smaller behind them. They walked until Rachel's legs ached and Noah began to sob quietly from exhaustion. She didn't stop. She couldn't. They had nothing. No money, no home, no safety net. Everything had collapsed slowly, then all at once. By the time they crossed the state line into Montana, dusk had begun to settle like ash. Rachel wasn't sure how far they'd come, only that the temperature had dropped and the wind stung sharper. The kids were too cold to cry now. Even Jacob's usual stoicism gave way to trembling lips. They arrived in a small town nestled between snow-covered ridges. It looked like a postcard frozen in the 1950s. White clapboard buildings, a post office with a crooked flag, and a church steeple that reached into the gray sky. Rachel approached the church first, guided by the faint yellow glow in its window. The door creaked open when she knocked, and an elderly man with a kind face and hesitant eyes stood in the doorway. "We don't need much," Rachel said, voice shaking. "Just a place to warm up." He looked over her shoulder at the kids, then back at her. "I'm sorry, we're full. Already helping another family." His eyes dropped. "Try the shelter in Bozeman, 30 miles south." Rachel nodded slowly, numb. "Thank you," she said, even though the words tasted like frostbite. She turned back to her children, the weight of the moment threatening to buckle her knees. Then she saw it. A rusted blue pickup truck rumbled slowly down the street and stopped just past the corner of the church. Snow clung to the fenders, and steam puffed from the exhaust like a breath held too long. The driver's door opened with a creak, and a tall man stepped out, wearing a patched canvas coat and boots caked in dried mud. He stood silently, watching them for a beat too long before speaking. "You need a place?" he asked, his voice low and even. Rachel blinked. The man's face was rugged, weathered like he'd lived outside of comfort for a long time. His beard was peppered with gray, and beneath the brim of his wool hat, his eyes held neither pity nor judgment, just something steady. "We don't have anywhere," Rachel admitted. He looked at the children one by one, his gaze pausing on Ellie's flushed cheeks. "I'm not a shelter," he said, "and I'm not good with strangers." "We don't need anything more than a warm floor," she replied. "Just for the night." The man didn't answer right away. Then he nodded once and gestured toward the truck. "Hop in." Rachel hesitated. Her instincts screamed not to trust anyone, especially a man alone in a remote place. But there was something in his posture, something that reminded her of how her father used to stand when he chopped firewood, like the world could blow apart, and he'd still hold steady. She nodded to Jacob, and the kids scrambled into the back seat. Rachel climbed into the front, Ellie still asleep in her arms. The heater was weak, but better than nothing. As the truck pulled away from the empty church, Rachel glanced sideways. "Thank you." The man didn't respond right away. "Name's Ben," he finally said. "Ben Whitaker." "Rachel." He nodded again, eyes on the snowy road. "It's not much," he said gruffly. "Cabin small, just me and my son." Rachel swallowed hard. "One night is all we need." Ben didn't look at her. "We'll see." The truck drove deeper into the pine-covered hills, the snow muffling the sound of the tires, the children huddled together in the back. Rachel closed her eyes for a second, just long enough to feel warmth creep into her bones, just long enough to feel, for the first time in weeks, that someone had finally opened a door. She didn't know then that this wouldn't be the end of their story, but the beginning. The truck rumbled through the pines in near silence, snow whispering against the windshield like a lullaby with no tune. Rachel sat rigid in the passenger seat, Ellie sleeping heavily against her shoulder, while her other children were crammed into the back seat with Ben's son, Eli, who hadn't said a single word since they met. They were too tired to speak, too wary to rest. Ben said nothing as they climbed deeper into the Montana woods, only nodding now and then, as if confirming turns only he knew. No GPS, no street signs, just instinct and memory guiding them along the narrowing road. After another 20 minutes, the trees opened up into a small clearing. Nestled at the edge of the woods stood a modest log cabin with a sloping tin roof and a crooked chimney puffing smoke into the dusky air. The porch leaned slightly left, and the window panes shimmered with ice. But the golden flicker from inside promised one thing Rachel hadn't felt in weeks: warmth. Ben parked and got out first, crunching over the snow without a word. He opened the passenger side, reached into the bed of the truck, and pulled out a wool blanket. Without asking, he draped it over Rachel's lap. "This way," he said, already heading up the porch steps. Inside, the warmth hit them in waves, dry, pine-scented heat radiating from a fire that glowed low in the hearth. The cabin was small and uncluttered, its walls lined with handmade shelves, dried herbs hanging from hooks, and a pair of worn boots tucked neatly beneath a coat rack. Eli sat by the fire, legs crossed, a sketch pad in his lap. He didn't look up as the children filed in, their eyes wide with both gratitude and confusion. He just kept drawing, his pencil moving with slow, deliberate strokes. Ben took their coats and pointed toward a wooden bench near the fireplace. "You can dry out here." Rachel murmured thanks, her voice hoarse. She eased Ellie onto a nearby armchair and helped Lila with her damp boots. Jacob and Noah huddled on the braided rug, their eyes flicking between the fire and the silent boy who had yet to speak a word. "This isn't permanent," Ben said, glancing briefly at Rachel. "One night, maybe two. I don't do guests." Rachel nodded. "Understood." He watched her a moment longer, then turned toward a side door. Only got one bedroom with bunks. It's yours tonight. I'll take the cot in the pantry. You don't have to. She started, but he was already gone. Rachel let the silence settle. It wasn't awkward, just foreign. A stillness that held no threat, no demand. She could hear the wind outside, the steady ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway, and the faint scratch of Eli's pencil on paper. Noah scooted closer to the fire, his cheeks pink from thawing. It smells like cinnamon, he whispered. Rachel smiled faintly. It does. Lila wandered near Eli, peeking at his sketch pad but saying nothing. He paused, glancing at her through long lashes, then turned the page slightly so she could see better. Lila's eyes lit up. That's us. He had drawn them. 5 figures, small and bundled, approaching a truck beneath the falling snow. No faces, just shapes and posture. The mother was unmistakable, a slight figure holding a child, head bowed. It was beautiful in its simplicity. It made Rachel's throat tighten. Thank you, Lila said softly. Eli nodded once, and for a moment, that was enough. Later that evening, after the kids had eaten slices of buttered bread and dried apple from Ben's pantry, Rachel washed the few dishes they'd used, her hands moving slowly under the warm tap water. She hadn't touched a real sink in days, the rhythm, the normalcy. It was almost painful. Ben sat at the small kitchen table, fixing a broken drawer with quiet focus. He said nothing, but Rachel noticed the way he worked. Calm, methodical, like every nail knew exactly where it needed to go. In the living room, Jacob and Noah were building towers from kindling blocks. Lila had seated herself beside Eli, threading red yarn through her fingers. Do you want one? She asked him. Eli blinked, then looked at the thin bracelet she was forming with practiced movements. Finger chaining, Rachel had called it once, something Lila used to do during long winter evenings. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Lila looped the yarn into a final knot and held it out. It means safe, she whispered. Eli took it, carefully, slowly, as if it were something breakable, and then, without a word, he slipped it over his wrist. Rachel saw the exchange from the kitchen doorway and turned away, her hand pressing to her chest. It had been so long since she'd seen her daughter smile without effort. That night, as the cabin dimmed and Ben moved through the space lighting oil lamps, Rachel helped the children into the bedroom. 2 sets of bunk beds, flannel blankets pinned along the walls for insulation, a small window looking out into darkness. It's not much, she murmured. It's more than enough, Jacob replied. Once they were settled and breathing slow, Rachel stepped back into the living room. The fire had died down, casting soft shadows across the handmade rug and the pine floorboards. Ben was seated in a worn armchair, sipping something from a tin mug. She didn't ask what it was. She just sat across from him on the sofa and stared into the fire. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Ben said, "My wife used to sit right where you are." Every night. Rachel turned toward him, surprised by the softness in his tone. Cancer, he added, took her fast. I'm sorry, she whispered. He nodded, then looked toward the fire. Built this place for her, for Eli. Figured we'd grow old here. He gave a dry, bitter smile. Plans changed. Rachel stared at the dancing embers, unsure what to say. She knew the weight of changed plans. She carried them in her spine, in the corners of her eyes. I was a nurse before, she said, in Casper, ER mostly. Quit after Aaron. Ben didn't reply, but she didn't expect him to. The silence between them was starting to feel less like emptiness and more like space to breathe. Later, after Ben had retreated to the pantry with a folded blanket and a pillow that had seen better days, Rachel remained by the hearth. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, creased, weather-stained, nearly forgotten. Inside were blank pages that used to hold dreams. She found a pencil, dull at the tip, and sharpened it with the edge of the fireplace grate. Then she began to sketch. She didn't think. She just let her hand move. Shapes, lines, the cabin, the fire. Her children curled together like puppies on the bunks. Eli by the hearth, red yarn on his wrist. She hadn't drawn in years, hadn't had the energy, or the reason. But now, As the snow whispered against the window and the fire flickered low, she felt her fingers move with purpose again, as if something inside her was remembering how to speak without words. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She only knew this. In a one-room cabin, warmed by a single fire, something had shifted. Not safety, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Morning came quietly, slipping through the frosted windows like it wasn't sure if it belonged. The light settled on the hardwood floor in pale streaks, brushing over the rumpled blanket Rachel had left on the couch and catching just the edge of Eli's sketchbook, still resting near the hearth. Rachel stirred first, her eyes opening to a moment of confusion before she remembered where they were. The fire had burned down to a dull glow, and the silence of the cabin felt strangely comforting, not hollow. She tucked Ellie in more tightly on the couch beside her and rose carefully, not wanting to wake anyone. Her feet touched the floor with the quiet reverence of someone who understood how fragile peace could be. In the kitchen, Ben was already up. He stood at the stove with his back to her, sleeves rolled up, stirring something thick and fragrant in a battered saucepan. The smell hit her like a memory, cinnamon and oats, the kind of scent that made houses feel like homes. "Morning," he said, not turning. "Good morning," Rachel replied, hugging herself for warmth. "You didn't have to make breakfast." "I always do. Eli eats early," Ben answered simply. Rachel glanced toward the fireplace. Eli was there again, cross-legged on the rug, sketching in the light of the fire like he hadn't moved all night. Only now, the red yarn bracelet Lila had made him was snug around his wrist, the soft fibers slightly frayed from where he'd fiddled with it in his sleep. He hadn't taken it off. She watched him draw, his posture calm, shoulders no longer tense. A small shift, but one she felt deeply. Leela had already begun to affect him, whether she knew it or not. "You don't talk much either, huh?" Rachel asked gently, sitting down near the hearth. Eli paused his drawing for the briefest moment, then gave the smallest shrug. "That's okay," she said. "Sometimes quiet people see more than the rest of us." Eli didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. That was enough. Later that morning, the children emerged sleepy-eyed but smiling. Noah's hair stuck out in all directions, and he grinned when he saw the bowl of steaming oatmeal waiting for him on the table. "I thought we were leaving," he said, crawling into a chair. Rachel hesitated. "We will. Soon." Ben glanced up from his coffee. "No rush," he said, surprising them both. Jacob's eyes met Rachel's, silently asking what she hadn't yet decided. "We'll help out today," she said quietly. "We want to earn our keep." Ben looked at her then, more carefully. "You don't have to." Rachel straightened her shoulders. "We want to." So they did. Ben handed Jacob and Lila each a pair of wool gloves and led them out to the shed where firewood was stacked haphazardly. He showed them how to sort and restack the wood so the logs could dry evenly. Leela asked questions, mostly about the different types of trees and why some bark was rougher than others, and Ben, to Rachel's surprise, answered everyone. Rachel stayed back to sweep the floors, wash the bedding, and gather the kids' clothing to dry by the hearth. Even Ellie helped in her own toddler way, handing over clothespins and tugging on the corner of a wool sock with the kind of determination only 3-year-olds could manage. Around midday, Rachel wandered into the living room and saw Eli's latest drawing left on the side table. It wasn't just a landscape, it was them, her children. Jacob holding a log over one shoulder, Lila in motion with her braid swinging, Noah laughing with his head thrown back. Even Ellie, wide-eyed and half-hidden behind a tree stump, and Rachel. She was drawn from the side, hair tucked behind one ear, eyes focused on something outside the frame. But she recognized herself. The curve of her back, the line of her jaw. There was tenderness in the sketch she hadn't seen in years. Not from others. Certainly not from herself. She picked it up, studying the fine lines. "I didn't mean to intrude." Ben's voice came from behind her. She turned, flustered. "You didn't. He's really talented." Ben nodded. "Always has been. Started drawing after Molly, after my wife passed." Rachel lowered the sketch. "I'm sorry." Ben leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Cancer doesn't care who it takes. She was diagnosed on a Monday. We had 12 weeks. Rachel swallowed. "That's not enough time." "It never is." A pause stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just honest. "I built this place during the first year after," he said quietly. "Didn't know what else to do with my hands. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't stay in town where people looked at me like I was a reminder of something they didn't want to feel." Rachel didn't speak. She knew that look, the one people gave when they didn't want your pain to spill into their perfectly ordered lives. Ben went on. "Eli didn't talk for months, just drew. I figured if I couldn't give him answers, I could at least give him space." Rachel looked down at the drawing again. "He sees a lot." Ben's voice was low. "He sees everything." That evening, after supper, boiled potatoes, fried eggs, and the last of the canned carrots, Rachel watched Lila pull out her red yarn again. She sat on the floor beside Eli, showing him how to make a new bracelet, this time with a twist in the pattern. "You can stack them," she said, wrapping it gently around his other wrist. "Red means safe, but if we add white, that means hope." Eli looked at her, really looked, then nodded once. She passed him the yarn. "Your turn." His fingers were clumsy at first, unsure, but Lila guided him with the same patience Rachel used to have when she taught her how to lace her boots. Loop by loop, they worked together until Eli's hands began to remember the rhythm. Rachel watched from the couch, Ellie asleep on her chest. She could smell cinnamon lingering from the oatmeal that morning, the faint hint of pine sap clinging to the children's clothes, and the subtle scent of something unfamiliar. Contentment. Not comfort, not yet, but something close. Ben sat in his usual chair, boots off, eyes watching the kids with a softness he probably didn't realize he wore. He didn't say much. He never did. But when Rachel caught him looking at her sketch pad resting on the end table, he said one thing. "You should keep drawing." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because the kids notice when you do." She didn't reply. She just reached for the pad, flipped it open to a new page, and let her pencil move in the light of the fire. A quiet peace had settled around them, one not announced with fanfare or milestones, but in the soft click of yarn between fingers, in the shared silence of sketching, in the way no one asked what tomorrow would bring. They were still guests, still strangers in a way, but for the first time in a long time, Rachel didn't feel like she was running. She felt still. And that, she realized, was a kind of miracle all its own. The attic above the cabin creaked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust floated in the beam of Ben's flashlight, catching the cold morning air in suspended spirals. Rachel pulled herself up carefully through the narrow hatchway, her boots finding uncertain footing on old pine planks. The space was low-ceilinged and cluttered with boxes, faded furniture, and the kind of forgotten belongings people can't quite throw away. Ben had mentioned there might be some extra blankets stored up here, and Rachel figured with temperatures dropping again, it was worth a look. What she hadn't expected was the cardboard box near the far wall, unmarked except for the faded word "mending" scribbled in red marker. She tugged it toward her, sneezed through the dust, and pried it open. Inside were fabric scraps, dozens of them. Some square, some jagged, many clearly cut with care. Old flannel denim, faded cotton, a strip of baby blue jersey knit, a piece of sunflower print cotton, so worn it was nearly translucent. Beneath the scraps lay a zippered pouch, stuffed with thread spools, a thimble, and a small tin of sewing needles. Her fingers moved gently, brushing over each piece like she was reading Braille. Something in her chest cracked open, quiet and deep. She hadn't sewn in years, not since her old Singer machine broke, and Aaron refused to fix it. "No time for hobbies," he had said, tossing it into the garage like a broken toy. But this wasn't hobby. It was memory. Rachel closed the box and brought it down the ladder. In the warmth of the cabin, she laid the contents out on the kitchen table. The scraps, the thread, the bits of the past waiting for new shape. Ellie climbed into her lap, poking at a bright red square. "Is this for me?" Rachel smiled. "It can be." When Ben returned from feeding the goats, he paused in the doorway. "That came from the attic?" Rachel nodded. "I think it was your wife's." He stepped closer, kneeling beside the table. His hand hovered over a strip of lavender fabric. "Yeah, this was from her Easter dress. Molly loved that color." Rachel watched him carefully, unsure if she should stop, but Ben didn't look angry, just distant. She always meant to make something out of all this, said scraps were pieces of a life too stubborn to throw away. Rachel looked down at the mismatched pieces. She was right. That afternoon, she started sewing by hand. The rhythm was slow, imperfect, but her fingers remembered what her mind had forgotten. She began stitching squares together without overthinking, letting instinct lead. Each piece carried a feeling, a memory, a prayer. Jacob sat beside her and asked if he could help. "Hold the fabric tight for me," she said. Lila picked color pairings with the precision of a painter. "These two go together," she said, placing a soft green beside a deep maroon. "They don't match, but they feel right." Even Noah helped, handing over buttons and tracing shapes with a stubby pencil. Rachel taught them how to line up corners, how to press seams flat, how to use small stitches to hold big things together. Later that night, Eli came forward, sketchbook in hand. He opened it to a new page, a grid of patchwork, with symbols in each square, a star, a tree, a boot, a heart. At the center, a house with smoke curling from the chimney. Rachel leaned over, studying it. "Is this for the quilt?" Eli nodded slowly. "It's a pattern," he whispered, his voice barely there. Ben looked up from across the room. It was the first word he'd heard his son say in weeks. Rachel smiled gently. "Then we'll use it." The next day, Ben returned from the barn with something wrapped in a plastic bin liner. He placed it on the table beside her without a word. Rachel unwrapped it slowly. It was a quilt, half finished, the edges still raw, threads hanging like veins from the seams. Soft blues, yellows, faded whites. The handwork was delicate and uneven, like someone had sewn while learning how to let go. "She started it before she got sick," Ben said. "I didn't have the heart to finish it, but maybe you can." Rachel touched the fabric, the same sunflower print she'd found upstairs. "I'd be honored," she said. That evening, while the wind howled against the walls and the fire burned bright, the cabin turned into something else, a workshop of memory and making. The children took turns helping. Even Ben sat nearby, sanding a block of wood into smoothness, his presence quiet but grounding. Rachel stitched well into the night. Her fingers ached, but her heart didn't. When she finally knotted the last square in place and laid the quilt out across the back of the couch, it looked nothing like perfection. The colors clashed. The edges weren't straight. A few of the squares puffed where the filling had shifted. But it was warm. It was real. It was made from scraps that should have been discarded but weren't. Lila named it the next morning. "We should call it Second Chances," she said, standing in her pajamas and tracing a line across one of the seams. "Why?" Rachel asked, curious. "Because that's what it is," Lila said. "Old things made new again." Eli walked over quietly and laid his drawing beside the quilt. 7 squares, 7 symbols. At the center, the house. Ben said nothing at first. Then, just loud enough to be heard over the creak of the wood stove, he said, "It suits." Rachel ran her hand over the stitching. Her breath caught, not from exhaustion, but from something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. They weren't a family yet, not officially, not even fully. But the quilt was a start. The snow started falling just after noon, thin flakes at first, fluttering like feathers from a torn pillow. By early evening, the sky had turned the color of bruised pewter, and the wind began to hum low through the pine trees like a warning. Rachel stood at the kitchen window, drying her hands with a dish towel. Outside, the world looked like it was holding its breath, the kind of stillness that came before things broke. "Storm's coming in hard," Ben said, stepping inside and stomping snow from his boots. Barometer dropped fast, winds shifting out of the northwest. He didn't need to say more. Rachel could feel it in her bones. By the time darkness fell, the wind was howling. It clawed against the cabin walls, rattling the window panes and piling snow against the porch in great heaving drifts. The kids sat close to the fire, bundled in extra blankets, their usual restlessness dulled by the noise and pressure in the air. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. Rachel froze. A beat of silence. Ben moved instantly, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer and checking the fuse box near the pantry. "Grid's down," he said. "Transformer's probably iced over. Won't be back up tonight. Maybe not for a few days." No one spoke. Lila reached for Rachel's hand. "What do we do?" "We stay warm," Rachel answered, her voice steady. "We stay together." They lit oil lamps and placed them around the room, casting flickering gold across the quilt on the couch and the drawings taped to the walls. The fire in the hearth became their heart, crackling, alive, and the only thing holding back the cold that pressed in from every direction. Ellie began to cough. At first, it was shallow, barely noticeable, but as the night wore on, it deepened, wet, raspy, and tight in her tiny chest. Rachel held her close, her hand pressed to Ellie's forehead. The heat there was unmistakable. "Bronchial," she said quietly, mostly to herself. Ben returned from the loft with extra blankets. "You need anything?" "Vapor rub, compress, honey, if we have it." "I've got some in the pantry, but no meds." Rachel bit the inside of her cheek. "We'll make do." They did what they could. Rachel wrapped Ellie in layers, placed warm cloths on her chest, and held her close beside the fire. She rocked gently, whispering lullabies and half-remembered stories from picture books they'd left behind in Wyoming. Outside, the storm roared. Snow battered the cabin like fists on a locked door. The walls creaked. The wind whistled through the tiniest seams. The temperature inside began to dip despite the fire. Ben watched the flames for a long moment, then stood. "I'll get more wood." "There's some stacked near the hearth," Rachel said quickly. "Not enough for the night," he replied. She started to rise. "I'll help." "Stay." His tone was firm but kind. "Keep her warm." Then he was gone, coat pulled tight, gloves thick, axe in hand. Rachel moved closer to the fire. Ellie curled into her lap, wheezing between shallow breaths. The boys were quiet, curled together under the quilt, while Lila sat near Eli, her small hand looped loosely through his. No one cried. They were beyond that, only listening, waiting. Time folded in on itself. Minutes passed like hours. Ellie's breathing stuttered, eased, stuttered again. Rachel felt her own heartbeat like a drum in her ears. Outside, she heard the thud of axe against wood, again and again. Ben didn't return for nearly 2 hours. When the door finally opened, a burst of frozen air swept through the room. Ben stumbled in, dragging a sled loaded with chopped logs. His beard was stiff with ice, his gloves torn. His shoulders trembled, but he moved with quiet urgency, stacking the wood beside the hearth, feeding the fire with fresh logs. Rachel helped him out of his coat. His fingers were red and cracked. "You're frozen," she said softly. "I'm fine." "You did this for us." Ben didn't answer. He simply sat on the floor and held his hands out toward the flames. Rachel draped a blanket over his shoulders and returned to Ellie, who was finally sleeping, her breathing still rough, but deeper now, more even. The fire crackled. Leela rested her head on Rachel's leg. Noah snored softly beneath the quilt. Jacob held a mug of warm water in both hands like it was something sacred. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. Ben had kept the cold at bay with his own hands, not because he had to, but because he chose to. That night, they slept in a heap near the fire. Ellie between Rachel and Lila. Eli with his sketchpad tucked against his chest. Even Ben remained nearby, his back resting against the couch, eyes watching the last glow of embers. When morning came, the power was still out, but the wind had stilled. Snow lay thick and high outside, but the sun was beginning to rise, soft and golden, glinting off icicles and warming the edges of the sky. Ellie stirred, coughing once, but the sound was looser now, less urgent. Rachel brushed the hair from her daughter's face, felt the fever had dropped. She looked over at Ben. He met her eyes, didn't smile, just nodded once. She nodded back. They had made it through the night, not because they had light or medicine or certainty, but because they had each other. The storm had passed, and what remained was something stronger than electricity, something born from wood and fire and the quiet resolve of people who refused to let one another freeze in the dark. It started with a quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing breaks, no one cries, and the sound of the fire is the loudest thing in the house. Rachel sat alone at the kitchen table, Ellie napping nearby with a book on her chest and the others scattered around the living room. Lila was teaching Noah how to loop yarn into a chain, Jacob was sorting fabric scraps for their next quilt, and Eli, quiet as always, was sketching with his knees drawn to his chest. Outside, the snow had finally begun to melt in places, revealing patches of frozen ground. The storm was over, but its shadow still lingered in their bones, the kind of tiredness that didn't fade just because the wind stopped blowing. Rachel pulled her notebook toward her, the one she kept folded closed beneath the bread box, pages filled with sketches and reminders and to-do lists she never finished. This time, she didn't draw. She wrote. It wasn't a letter meant for anyone, not even herself, really. But the words poured out like water through a cracked dam. She didn't think, didn't censor, just let the pencil move across the paper. It began. To the woman I used to be, I know you're tired. I know you're scared and angry, and more alone than you'll ever admit, even to yourself. She wrote of the nights she cried in the dark while the kids slept 2 feet away, the mornings she forced a smile onto her face like makeup, the meals she skipped to save food, the moments she thought maybe, just maybe, it would be better to disappear. She wrote about Aaron, his charm that turned to cruelty, the years she clung to hope like a rope that frayed more with every pull. But more than that, she wrote about the day she left, the snow, the silence. The moment Ben Whitaker, a man she didn't know, stood in a church parking lot and said, without saying, "You can come with me." She ended the letter with one line that felt too simple and too big at once. You didn't know it then, but the fire wouldn't go out. Not this time. Rachel read the letter once, then twice, then folded it slowly and tucked it into an envelope she found in a drawer, intending to throw it away later. She placed it on the edge of the table, unfinished, unsealed. Just one more forgotten thing in a house full of them. She didn't know Jacob had seen it. Didn't see him reach for it when helping Rachel gather quilt orders for shipping that evening. Didn't notice when he placed it, by mistake, with the stack of wrapped packages headed to the post office via Cheryl, the librarian from town, who helped them mail online orders every Thursday. 2 days later, the email came. It was from Cheryl, subject line, "Was this letter meant to be included?" Rachel stared at the message, heart thudding. The email included a photo of the opened envelope. Cheryl had read it and posted it. "I didn't know who it was, too, or what it was for," Cheryl wrote, "but I cried. I read it aloud at the library's writing circle last night, and now people keep asking me to print copies. I hope that's okay. I think someone needed to hear it." Rachel felt her breath catch. She hadn't signed the letter, hadn't addressed it, but now it was loose in the world, like a page torn from her diary and carried off by the wind. Ben found her standing in the middle of the kitchen, still staring at the screen. "You okay?" he asked. Rachel hesitated. "I didn't mean for anyone to read it. It wasn't finished." He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Maybe someone needed to read it unfinished." She looked up. "I wrote it to the woman I used to be. I didn't think it mattered to anyone else." Ben's voice was quiet. "That woman's still out there, lots of them." The next day, the post office called, then a podcast in Idaho, then a regional newsletter. By the end of the week, Rachel's inbox was full. Emails from strangers, single moms, widows, daughters, women with different lives, but the same weight on their shoulders. "I printed your letter and read it every morning before work. My sister's leaving an abusive marriage. She said your words gave her courage. I didn't know anyone else felt that kind of tired." Rachel read every message. Some made her cry, some made her ache, but all of them reminded her of something she hadn't dared to believe in a long time. Maybe her pain wasn't a dead end. Maybe it was a path for someone else. That night, she stood near the fire, watching the shadows flicker across the quilt they'd named Second Chances. Eli sat on the floor, drawing. Jacob was rereading one of the borrowed library books. Lila and Noah were curled up under a shared blanket, giggling at some inside joke. Ben handed her a mug of tea. Still want to throw it away? He asked, nodding toward the letter she'd printed and set on the mantel. Rachel shook her head slowly. No. They stood in silence for a moment. Funny, Ben said, how something you didn't mean to share becomes the thing people need most. She looked at him. Is that what happened with you and Eli? He thought for a second. Maybe. I thought I was done. After Molly passed, I figured the only thing I had left to give was space, quiet. But then you all showed up, and I realized maybe space isn't the only thing people need. Rachel's voice was soft. What else? Ben looked down at the children. A reason to keep the fire going. That night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table again, a blank page before her. She didn't write a letter this time. She just wrote one word at the top of the page. Hope. Not because she was healed, not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time in a long time, she wanted to begin something, not for survival, but for someone else. And maybe that was how healing started, not in the quiet, not in the fixing, but in the sharing. The knock came late Tuesday morning, sharp and deliberate, not the kind of knock meant for neighbors or friends. It echoed through the cabin like a cold draft, pulling Rachel from her thoughts as she helped Ben roll out biscuit dough at the kitchen table. The air outside still held a bite, but the snow had mostly melted into patches of stubborn ice, revealing muddy grass and sun-warmed pine needles. Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and crossed the living room. Through the small window beside the door, she saw two figures on the porch. One she recognized instantly, Dolores Brennan, wrapped in a camel-colored wool coat with her hair pinned so tightly it looked sculpted. The other was a tall man in a dark overcoat, silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, a black leather briefcase in hand. Rachel's throat tightened. She opened the door halfway. "Morning," she said, guarded. Dolores offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rachel, this is Robert Keene, my legal counsel." Rachel's grip on the doorknob tightened. Keene stepped forward. "May we come in?" "No," Rachel said firmly, "but you can say what you came to say." He adjusted his glasses and opened a folder. "Mrs. Brennan is petitioning for full legal guardianship of your 4 children." Rachel blinked, the porch shifting beneath her feet like the ground was giving way. "Custody?" she repeated. "As next of kin to their deceased father, Mrs. Brennan has the legal standing to file for full guardianship. The claim is based on concerns about the children's safety and well-being." Rachel's voice dropped. "What concerns?" Dolores didn't wait for the lawyer. "Living in a shack, with a man you barely know, no electricity during a storm, no running water half the time. Is that your idea of parenting?" "We're fine," Rachel said, biting back the heat in her throat. "They're safe. They're loved. That's more than they ever were under your roof." Dolores scoffed. "You left my son." "He was hurting them," Rachel snapped, "and you know it." Before Dolores could respond, heavy footsteps approached from the side of the cabin. Ben rounded the corner, sleeves rolled up, an axe still in one hand from chopping kindling. He saw the visitors and immediately straightened. "Something wrong?" he asked. Rachel shook her head, but her eyes betrayed her. Ben stepped beside her on the porch, glancing between the lawyer and Dolores. "She's trying to take the kids," Rachel said quietly. Ben's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" Keene cleared his throat. "We'll let the court determine that." "You've got a date?" Ben asked. 3 weeks from today. You'll be served official notice within 48 hours. Dolores didn't speak again. She simply stared at Rachel, cool, unwavering, like this was some inevitable thing she was simply allowing to play out. Rachel stood her ground. "I won't let you take them." Dolores raised a brow. "You may not have a choice." Rachel's voice wavered for only a second. "Then I'll fight." Ben's voice came low, firm beside her. "We'll fight." Keene gave a nod. "We'll see you in court." They left without another word. The crunch of their boots on the gravel lingered even after the SUV pulled away from the property. Inside, the cabin had gone silent. Jacob stood in the hallway, his eyes wide. "Are they taking us?" he asked. Rachel walked over and pulled him into her arms. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The next few days were a blur of calls, paperwork, and rising tension. Rachel reached out to a legal aid office in Bozeman, and they matched her with a volunteer attorney, young, underpaid, but fierce. She began compiling everything she had: the children's schoolwork, letters from their old pediatrician, photos of them working on the farm, journal entries, the letter that had gone viral. Ben built a shelf near the fireplace, just for organizing court documents. Rachel started waking before sunrise to outline her testimony. At night, she lay awake staring at the beams overhead, terrified she might lose the very thing that gave her life meaning. "Why is she doing this?" Lila asked one night, as Rachel braided her hair for bed. "Some people don't understand love unless it looks like theirs," Rachel said. "And when they can't control it, they try to destroy it." Lila nodded slowly. "She doesn't know us." "No," Rachel whispered. "She never wanted to." Ben didn't say much during the preparation. He worked harder than ever, hauling wood, repairing the goat fence, teaching Jacob how to clean and oil tools. But in the quiet, he watched. He knew what was at stake, and though he never asked for it, he became Rachel's anchor. "I've never been to court," she told him one night by the fire, her voice thin. "I don't know what I'm doing." "You're telling the truth," he said. "That's more than most people can offer." Eli sat near the hearth that night, sketchpad in his lap. He hadn't spoken much since Dolores came, but Rachel noticed he was drawing more than usual, quietly, intensely, with the kind of focus that made time fall away. On the eve of the court hearing, Eli walked up to Rachel with a folded sheet of paper and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked gently. He shrugged. "For tomorrow." Rachel opened it carefully. It was a drawing, 7 figures, standing side by side in front of the cabin. Rachel, Ben, the 4 children, and Eli himself. But what caught her breath was the detail. Every figure had a face, every hand was joined, and above them, in bold red crayon, one word floated over the roof of the cabin. Home. She looked up, tears threatening. "Eli, this is beautiful." He gave a tiny nod. "It's what I see." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her bag. "I'm going to bring this with me," she said, "to remind them." "Of what?" he asked. She looked at him, her voice steady now. "That family isn't blood, it's choice, and we've already chosen each other." The county courthouse in Bozeman sat beneath a gray sky, its stone facade as cold and impersonal as the law it housed. The waiting room outside the family courtroom smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee, and every ticking second from the wall clock only tightened the knot in Rachel's stomach. She sat on the hard bench with her hands folded around a manila folder full of statements, school records, and photos. Next to her, Ben leaned forward, forearms on his knees, silent as always, but steady. Eli sat between them, holding his sketch pad like it was armor. Dolores Brennan arrived in pearls and posture, flanked by her lawyer and a sharply dressed man Rachel vaguely recognized from her wedding. Aaron's uncle, maybe. She didn't speak to Rachel, didn't even glance her way, but the tightness in her mouth said more than words could. Rachel stood on shaking legs. Ben rose beside her. Inside, the courtroom was nearly empty. Pale walls, fluorescent lights, a judge in black robes, glasses low on her nose. A court reporter sat at her keyboard in the corner, the clack of her keys already whispering tension into the air. Rachel took her seat at one table, Dolores at the other. The judge adjusted her glasses. "We're here today to address a petition for custody of 4 minor children, filed by Mrs. Dolores Brennan. Let's begin." Dolores's lawyer went first. He painted a picture Rachel barely recognized, one of recklessness, instability, and a mother who'd taken her children to live in a remote cabin with a man of unknown character and limited resources. He spoke of harsh winters, lack of consistent medical care, and the emotional trauma of losing a father. Rachel clenched her fists under the table. Then it was her turn. She stood slowly, holding nothing but a single page in her hands. She looked at the judge, not at Dolores, not at the lawyer. "I won't pretend I've done everything right," she began. "But I've done everything I could. I left a dangerous situation not because it was easy, but because I wanted my children to grow up without fear." She spoke of the long nights, the storm, Ellie's sickness. She spoke of finding shelter when there was none, of kindness in the shape of firewood and silence. "My children are not just surviving," she said. "They're healing. They are warm, fed, homeschooled, and heard. And for the first time in years, they are not afraid to sleep." Ben was called next. He stood tall in his worn flannel shirt and boots, looking out of place amid the suits and fluorescent lights. But when he spoke, the room quieted. "I didn't plan on any of this," he said. "Didn't ask for it. But when I saw Rachel and those kids standing in the snow, I remembered what it felt like to be left behind. I didn't want them to feel that." The lawyer pressed him. "Is there a romantic relationship between you and Ms. Hartman?" Ben glanced at Rachel, then back at the judge. "Not at first," he said simply. "Back then it was just an act of basic human decency." "And now?" Ben didn't hesitate. "Now it's more. But that's not what this is about. It's about 4 kids who smile in the morning and sleep through the night. That's more than I could say about myself at their age." The judge nodded, making notes. Then came the unexpected. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said, looking toward Eli, "is that your son?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Does he wish to speak?" Eli's fingers tightened on his sketchpad. Rachel turned to him. "Only if you want to, sweetheart." He looked up, nodded. A bailiff led him forward. He walked slowly, carefully, his steps deliberate. When he reached the bench, he held up the drawing Rachel had tucked in her bag the night before, the one with 7 figures standing in front of the cabin, hands joined, the word home written in bright red crayon above them. He didn't say a word, just handed it to the judge. She looked at it for a long moment. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes flicked up toward Eli. "Did you draw this?" He nodded once. "Can you tell me what it means?" Eli hesitated. Then, in the softest voice anyone had heard from him in that room, he said, "It means we're together." The judge blinked. She handed the drawing back gently. "That's all I need," she said. The courtroom fell silent. Then came the ruling. "I find that Rachel Hartman has demonstrated both capability and emotional fitness to continue raising her children in a stable environment. Petition for custody is denied. Full guardianship remains with the mother." Dolores didn't react. She simply stood, gathered her coat, and walked out of the courtroom without a word. Rachel didn't move. She barely breathed. Ben placed a hand on her back. "It's over," he said quietly. She nodded. They left the courthouse into pale sunlight, the sky beginning to clear. The air was still cold, but it didn't feel bitter anymore. Jacob held Rachel's hand. Lila clutched Eli's sleeve. Noah skipped ahead, asking if they could get hot cocoa on the way home. Ellie slept in Ben's arms, cheek against his chest. They didn't say much on the drive back. They didn't have to. That evening, back at the cabin, Rachel unfolded the drawing Eli had given the judge. She pinned it to the wall above the fireplace. Then she stepped back, stared at it, and whispered to herself, "We spoke up." And for the first time in her life, it was enough. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, small, quiet ones. A single crocus blooming beside the front steps. A trickle of melted snow beneath the eaves. The shift in morning light from pale gray to something closer to gold. At the cabin, life adjusted to the slow turning of the season. The goats bleated louder now in the morning. The children's boots no longer crunched through snow, but splashed through mud puddles in last autumn's leaves. Even the wind had softened. Rachel sat on the porch swing, a cup of coffee warm in her hands, watching Lila braid Ellie's hair. There was laughter again, small, real laughter, not the kind that hides fear, but the kind that echoes because it has nowhere else to go. Inside, the walls were fuller. Eli's drawings had multiplied, and now lined the hallway like a silent gallery. Quilts lay draped over chairs and stair rails. Each stitch, each square, part of a new kind of memory, one they'd made together. Ben had started working on a new project out back. He didn't mention it at first, just started hauling lumber to the edge of the clearing where the sugar maple stood, its branches beginning to sprout soft, bright buds. Rachel found him there one morning, smoothing the edge of a thick plank with his calloused hands. A toolbox sat nearby, open to the sunlight. "What's this?" she asked. He looked up, squinting. "Bench." "For sitting?" she teased. He smirked. "No, for dancing." "Of course, for sitting." She laughed softly. "It's beautiful wood." "Old firewood I never used," he said. "Split it last fall. Figured it deserved more than burning." Rachel knelt beside him, running her fingers over the wood grain. "You're making something new from something meant to be destroyed." Ben didn't respond right away. Then he said, "That's how most good things start." He finished the bench a few days later. Simple, sturdy, smooth as stone worn by time. On the center slat of the backrest, he carved a single word: stillness. No explanation, no speech. He just placed it beneath the maple, facing the open clearing where the children often played, and the mountains peeked in from the horizon. That evening, Rachel wandered out to find him already there, seated with his elbows on his knees, watching the sky shift from blue to blush. She sat beside him without a word. They stayed like that for a long time. No questions, no distractions, just the sound of wind through budding branches and the distant voices of children building something from sticks and old imagination. Rachel finally spoke. "I used to think healing looked like fixing." Ben nodded slowly. "Me too." "But it doesn't, does it?" she said. "It's slower, quieter, like growing roots under the surface, before you ever see the bloom." He didn't speak, but the way he looked at her told her she wasn't wrong. Rachel leaned back. "You ever wonder if you'll stop missing her?" "Molly?" he asked, eyes soft. "Every day, and no, I don't think it works like that." Rachel folded her hands in her lap. "I still hear Aaron's voice sometimes. Not the good parts, the sharp parts, the ones that made me question my own breath." Ben turned toward her. "You don't owe his memory your silence." She looked at him, really looked. The lines in his face, the steady hands, the man who had swung an axe in a blizzard without being asked, who had shared his home without condition. "I think," she said slowly, "I might be ready." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "To start again." Ben looked away, toward the field where Jacob was helping Eli tie kite string to a branch. "Then I'll be here," he said. They didn't touch, didn't need to, but something passed between them, heavier than wind, lighter than regret. A kind of peace that wasn't forced. Stillness. Later that night, Rachel found herself back at the bench, this time alone. The children had gone to bed. Ben was in the kitchen cleaning up the dinner dishes, humming under his breath. She sat beneath the maple tree, the bench cool beneath her hands, and closed her eyes. Somewhere behind her, a window opened. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the air. And for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like a woman who had lost everything. She felt like someone who was learning how to stay. It started with a letter, or rather, a ripple from a letter that was never meant to be read by anyone but herself. Rachel stood at the kitchen counter, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air when the envelope arrived. Cream-colored with a hand-inked return address from a small magazine based in Missoula. She opened it cautiously, heart thudding in that familiar way, the kind of anxiety that never fully left, even after the storm passed. Inside was a short note from the editor of Front Range Living, a regional lifestyle magazine known for highlighting Montana's unsung stories. The editor had seen the letter Cheryl shared online, then read more through Rachel's handmade quilt shop listings. "We believe our readers would be deeply moved by your story and the meaning behind your quilts. If you're willing, we'd love to feature your work in our spring issue." Rachel sat down at the table, her breath catching slightly. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about recognition. It was about being seen, fully, not as a cautionary tale or a shadow of someone else's name, but as herself. She showed the letter to Ben later that evening as the kids played out back. He read it quietly, then handed it back with a small nod. "You going to do it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me still feels like we're just beginning." "Maybe that's why it matters," he said. "People don't always need to hear how it ends. Sometimes they just need to know it's possible to begin again." So she agreed. A week later, a writer and photographer drove up the long dirt road leading to the cabin. Rachel served coffee in mismatched mugs, apologized for the kids running through the kitchen barefoot, and showed the quilts one by one. She talked about memory, motherhood, fabric, and firewood. She didn't cry until the photographer asked what the first quilt was called. Second chances, she said, tears catching her off guard, because that's what this place gave us. When the magazine came out, something strange happened. Orders didn't just trickle in, they flooded. Teachers from Oregon, grandmothers from Nebraska, nurses from North Dakota, women who had left, women who had stayed too long, daughters who wanted to give their mothers something that felt like being held. Rachel's small corner of the internet, the one she used mostly to post quiet photos of stitching and sunsets, was suddenly filled with messages. I gave this quilt to my sister after her divorce. She said it made her feel seen. This isn't just fabric, it's story, it's survival. The kids helped where they could. Jacob organized shipping labels. Lila paired fabric squares and even started sewing a few of her own. Noah wrote thank you notes on colored paper, signing them from the cabin with the red tree. Even Ellie would toddle in to hold down corners of folded quilts with her tiny hands. And Eli, he began drawing quilt patterns, not in grids, but in stories. His sketch pad was filled with swirls and symbols, stars, rivers, firewood, footprints, each one inspired by something he'd heard or seen or quietly felt. One afternoon, Rachel found him drawing a map. "What's that one?" she asked, crouching beside him. Eli pointed to the center. Us. The shape was small, but at the heart of it all, Ben, meanwhile, had taken notice of a quiet visitor who started coming around once a week. Drew Harper, a school counselor from Bozeman. He was part of a youth mentorship program trying to get more hands-on opportunities for teens struggling with trauma or school suspension. "We've got kids who don't do well in classrooms," Drew had said one afternoon, watching Ben sharpen tools in the shed. "But they listen when their hands are moving. We're looking for someone who can teach woodworking, slow work, purposeful, stuff that doesn't need perfection to be good." Ben hesitated. "I'm not a teacher." "Not yet," Drew said, "but you've already taught more than most of us ever could." He didn't say yes that day, but the next morning he spent an hour reorganizing the wood shop. That afternoon, he built a second workbench. By spring's full arrival, the cabin didn't feel like a temporary place anymore. It had rhythm, cycles, joy, even plans. Rachel caught herself writing "next year" in her planner, talking about planting new herbs in May, discussing a second sewing machine. Ben started sketching a chicken coop blueprint with Jacob. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed and the sun had dipped behind the mountains in a blaze of soft gold and lavender, Rachel and Ben sat on the stillness bench beneath the maple tree. The buds had turned to soft green leaves, and a breeze moved through them like music. She turned to him, her voice quiet. "Do you ever think this was meant to happen?" Ben considered. "Not meant, maybe. But maybe it mattered that we stayed open to it." She nodded. "I've lived so much of my life waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under me. But lately, you feel like you're standing on something solid," he finished for her. She smiled. "Yeah." They didn't talk about the future in terms of certainty, but they talked about it. That was new. That was enough. A quilt lay across Rachel's lap that night, one she hadn't named yet. It was stitched with pieces of an old shirt Ben had worn through the winter, a square of red yarn from Noah, and the hem of the dress Ellie had arrived in that snowy night. Rachel smoothed it gently and whispered, "Maybe this one's called Becoming." Ben looked down at her hands, then at the house behind them, filled with firelight and laughter. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds right." The sun rose slow and warm over the town of Pine Hollow, brushing the mountains with honey light and promising the first true day of spring. The air smelled of new grass and wood smoke and everything. The dirt roads, the shop windows, the old gazebo in the center of town seemed to hum with quiet energy. It was the day of the spring gathering. Nothing fancy, just an old tradition revived by the townsfolk. A farmer's market, live music, a homemade pie contest, and local crafts set out on folding tables, lined with gingham. For Rachel, it was the first time in years she'd shown up to something not as a shadow or a side note, but as someone who had something to share. They'd given her a corner spot near the stage, under a wide oak tree that had just begun to bud. A wooden sign painted by Lila in her careful, curly handwriting read, "Stories in Stitching." And beneath it, folded and stacked in neat rows, were the quilts. Each one named, each one stitched with a piece of the life they had rebuilt. Second chances, stillness, becoming, the one with red yarn. Rachel arranged them with care, smoothing corners, tucking corners beneath the breeze. Around her, the kids darted between booths, Noah selling bookmarks made from fabric scraps, Jacob explaining quilt names to curious passersby like a museum docent, Noah proudly handing out flyers he designed with "Our Mom is Awesome" in bold blue marker. Ben had disappeared earlier in the morning, saying only, "Got something to do before the crowd really shows up." Rachel assumed he was chopping wood or helping a neighbor fix a busted fence post. But she was wrong. Midway through the afternoon, just as the sun peaked and the scent of kettle corn began to drift across the field, a familiar sound cut through the background hum of voices and kids laughing. It was a banjo, old, worn, rich. Rachel turned toward the small stage in disbelief, and there he was, Ben Whitaker, standing beneath a string of paper lanterns, holding the banjo like it had always belonged in his hands. He didn't say much, just stepped up to the mic and cleared his throat. "I'm not one for speeches," he said, "but sometimes music says what words can't." Then he played. The tune was simple, no flashy runs, no flourishes, but it was full of memory, of steady rhythm, of something that felt like the sound of healing. People paused, turned, listened. Rachel blinked back sudden tears. Eli stood beside her, still as stone, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden box. He held it out to her. "For you," he said softly. Rachel knelt to meet him eye to eye. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Open it." She did, slowly, carefully, like it might vanish if she moved too fast. Inside was the red yarn bracelet, the very first one Lila had given Eli that winter night by the fire. It was faded now, a little frayed, but perfectly coiled like something sacred. Beneath it was a square of quilt, stitched from two distinct fabrics, one piece from the flannel shirt Rachel had worn the day they arrived, and another from Ben's old work shirt, the collar edge with the tear she'd mended weeks ago. Carved into the inside lid, in Eli's careful, uneven hand, was one word: us. Rachel pressed her hand over her heart. She looked up at him, voice trembling. "Thank you." Eli nodded, then quietly took her hand and led her to the front of the booth, where the family was beginning to gather. Ben was still playing, and the music rose like sunlight over the crowd, quiet, full of breath, completely unafraid. The kids crowded around her, Lila tugging on her sleeve, Noah pointing toward the group of people forming a line to ask about the quilts, Jacob grinning like someone who had seen a storm and lived to tell the tale. Rachel looked around, at the display of stories stitched in fabric, at the children who were no longer broken pieces but whole, joyful threads, at Ben on that stage, playing not because he had to, but because he chose to, and at Eli, silent, wise, holding the box that said everything none of them had needed to explain. She wasn't surviving anymore. This was home. This was family. This was us. The cabin hadn't changed much. The pantry door still stuck when it rained. The floorboard by the fireplace creaked every third step, and the roof slanted just enough to catch falling pine needles year-round. But somehow, it felt entirely different now. Alive. Wind chimes made from bent spoons and old keys sang quietly in the breeze, strung from the porch by Noah and Lila. Bare footprints wandered through the soft garden soil behind the house, proof of Noah's endless curiosity and Ellie's wobbly independence. The once empty yard now held flower beds bordered with mismatched stones, a homemade birdhouse nailed crooked to a fence post, and the echo of laughter that came not out of relief, but out of joy. Inside, the walls were warmer too, not because of insulation or fresh paint, but because they held stories now. Drawings from Eli covered the hallway, organized by Jacob into a timeline of sorts. One drawing in particular hung above the fireplace, 7 figures, hand in hand, standing in front of a giant quilt that stretched across the page like a flag. In the corner, Eli had written one word in careful block letters: family. The air buzzed with life on the afternoon of the picnic. Folding tables were set out in the yard, draped in old patchwork cloths. Quilts were laid on the grass for kids to sprawl across. The smell of grilled vegetables, cornbread, and berry pies lingered in the air as neighbors, homeschool families, and even a few strangers who had ordered quilts online made their way up the long drive. Music played from a speaker near the porch. Later, Ben would pull out his banjo again, and no one would be surprised. Rachel stood barefoot in the grass, her hair braided back, holding a pitcher of lemonade in one hand and watching Ellie toddle toward the tree swing. Noah chased her brothers around the garden path, red yarn wrapped around her wrist like a badge of honor. Near the porch steps, Cheryl, the librarian who had unknowingly sparked it all, handed out bookmarks made from leftover fabric scraps, telling anyone who asked that the woman in the article was even kinder in real life. Rachel smiled and waved as someone complimented the quilts, but her attention was drawn toward the tree at the edge of the clearing. The old maple stood tall and steady, its branches full and green, casting long shadows across the grass. Ben was there, sitting on the bench he'd carved from firewood, the word stillness now weathered into the grain. He looked up as she approached, scooted slightly to make room without saying a word. Rachel sat beside him and exhaled. The sun filtered through the leaves above them, dappling the ground in gold and soft green. Children's voices carried on the breeze, and someone clapped in rhythm to a fiddle tune playing through the speaker. Ben reached over and took her hand. No grand gesture, just presence, steady, solid, known. Rachel leaned her head against his shoulder. "This," she whispered, "this is the miracle." He didn't reply, but his thumb brushed against her knuckles, once gently, like an answer. They stayed that way for a while, not speaking, just breathing, just being. Later that evening, as the sky turned the color of soft plums and the first stars blinked awake, the children laid on quilts beside the fire pit. Lila sang a lullaby off-key, Noah plucked flower petals, and Jacob tried to explain constellations using a flashlight and sheer confidence. Eli sat with his sketchbook in his lap, red yarn still tied around his ankle like a silent tether to something sacred. He turned a page and began to draw. This one was different. It wasn't just their family, it was a quilt. But this quilt was bigger than any he'd drawn before. Inside its panels were memories, a banjo, a snowstorm, a firewood bench, a courtroom drawing, a red bracelet, a folded letter, and woven between them, 7 figures, stitched into the center, surrounded by everything they'd survived, everything they'd chosen, everything they had become. He titled it in the margin, "The Ones Who Stayed." The stars were out in full now, and the fire crackled as Rachel tucked Ellie beneath a quilt, and Noah yawned beside her. Ben poured cider into mismatched mugs. Cheryl and the neighbors said their goodbyes, promising to return for more quilts, more songs, more stories. Rachel stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the lanterns sway on the porch and the wind ripple through the maple's branches. She felt it again, not the ache of what had been lost, but the hum of what had been found. Not built from bricks or blood, but from kindness, choice, the end staying. Because in the end, the miracle hadn't been in being rescued. It was in being rebuilt, together. Sometimes, the greatest stories don't end with a grand rescue or a perfect resolution. They end in a quiet cabin, under a maple tree, with laughter in the background and peace where there used to be pain. Rachel didn't set out to become a symbol of strength. She wasn't looking to be anyone's inspiration. She was just a mother doing her best, with nothing left but 4 kids, a busted suitcase, and a little bit of hope she barely dared to believe in. But sometimes, when the world shuts every door, one opens in the most unexpected place. This story is about second chances. Not the shiny kind we see in movies, but the raw, unglamorous kind that starts with frostbitten fingers and a stranger's voice in the snow saying, "Hop in." It's about what happens when broken people refuse to break each other, when a silent boy offers a red yarn bracelet, when firewood becomes a love language, and when quilts tell stories that words can't hold. It's about choosing to stay, not because it's easy, but because it matters. And maybe most of all, it's about the kind of family that isn't written in blood, but stitched together in quiet acts of courage, over shared meals, midnight fevers, and drawings passed across a courtroom. We hope Rachel's journey reminded you of something important, that healing doesn't look like perfection. It looks like a chipped mug full of tea, a sketch on crumpled paper, a banjo at a spring fair, a bench carved from the wood meant for burning. If her story touched you, if you saw even a small piece of your own journey in hers, tell us. Leave a comment below. Tell us about the moments you chose to stay. Tell us about the person who opened their door when no one else would. Or maybe, tell us what you're still hoping for. Because your story matters too. And if this story spoke to something deep inside you, we'd be honored if you joined our community. Hit that subscribe button, not just to support our channel, but to stay connected with stories that remind us that even in the darkest seasons, there's still warmth to be found. We've got more stories coming, real ones, hard ones, beautiful ones, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, often without even realizing it. So stay with us, there's more to come. And if no one's told you this today, you're not alone. You're part of this. We'll see you in the next story.